Let me tell you something about justice in the Galactic Federation. It's a myth, a convenient fiction, especially when you're dragged before the Tribunal of Seven Worlds with a court advocate who can't even pronounce your name correctly. I'd know. I've been the Tribunal's official transcriber for 273 cycles. That's about 900 Earth years if you're curious. And trust me, I've witnessed more than most beings live to forget. The bribery, the shadow agreements, the decisions, made before proceedings even began. It's all one giant cosmic farce, minus the humor. But then came the moment everything shifted. The moment the humans spoke. Name's Zort Pibble, by the way. I'm a fourth-gen Verarian bureaucrat with dermal pigment like what humans describe as radioactive citrus and 6 ocular nodes in a flawless hexagonal spread. My function? Simple. Document every word spoken in the tribunal hall. No opinions, no commentary, just pure transcription. And for 900 years, that was enough for me. That is, until the hearing for Ambassador Tarabel. All rise for the honored. Adjudicators of the 7 worlds, bellowed Court Marshal Grun, his voice echoing across the vast crystalline. Wait, protocol says I can't use that term. Let's go with the enormous transparent hall. I exhaled slowly, air bladders expanding with the specially balanced atmospheric blend filtered into the chamber. Here we go again. Another trial. Another foregone conclusion. The 7 judges hovered, in on their gravity platforms, each a representative of a founding world. Judge Vololo of Zenturi, all 8 tentacles poised and his expression eternally unimpressed. Judge Pax of Regal Minor, his facial ridges pulsing purple whenever irritation flared. Judge Krill of Dominar, whose avian ancestors still echoed in her movements, notably that unsettling tilt of her head exactly 45 degrees when locking onto her prey. Or, I suppose, the accused. The remaining 4 were just as formidable. Judge Trill, no relation to Krill and deeply resentful of being asked, Judge Mox, and Judge Lulu. Don't be misled by the charming name. She once placed an entire lunar colony under indefinite lockdown because someone sneezed near her mid-deliberation. And finally, presiding over them all, Grand Judge Zorix, a translucent entity whose species conveyed speech via chromatic pulses undulating across their semi-fluid forms. Present the accused, boomed Grun, rapping his ceremonial staff thrice, upon the tribunal floor. At the far end of the chamber, immense doors slid open with practiced precision, and in came, strode Ambassador Tarabel of Earth. I've witnessed hundreds of humans shuffle through this chamber over the centuries. Some begged, others screamed, a few even tried to bolt. But Tarabel did none of that. She entered with the calm assurance of someone arriving at a diplomatic banquet, not a judicial execution. Her dark skin stood in bold contrast against the stark white of the tribunal-issued defendant's robe. Her hair, a tightly woven crown of coils, shimmered with embedded metallic beads that caught the light of the chamber's refracted glow with every confident movement. Ambassador Tarabel of Earth, Grun intoned formally, you are charged with espionage, sabotage, and incitement of rebellion on the restricted world of Neo's Prime. How do you answer these accusations? Before the ambassador could reply, her assigned defender, a visibly jittery play-lead-on named Blip, leapt in. Esteemed judges, we enter a plea of... But Tarabel's voice sliced through the air like a plasma cutter through alloy. Not guilty, and I will be representing myself. A ripple of astonished gasps surged through the observation tiers. Self-representation. In this tribunal. Was the human completely mad? Blip looked like he might faint, his translucent skin turning a sickly shade of blue. Ambassador, I must advise against this course of action. The tribunal procedures are complex and thank you for your service, Advocate Blip, Bell said, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. "But I have got this." Judge Vololo's tentacles curled in irritation. "This is most irregular. The accused does not simply dismiss their advocate. Actually, Deb Bell said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, according to Statute 72993, subsection D of the Tribunal Code, any defendant has the right to self-representation, provided they can demonstrate basic knowledge of Galactic law. I'd be happy to recite the relevant passages if the court requires proof of my qualifications." The judges exchanged glances. Well, 6 of them did. Judge Zorix just turned a confused shade of orange. "Very well," Grand Judge Zorix's translator device intoned. "The accused may represent herself. Prosecutor Datra, you may present the case against Ambassador Bell." Prosecutor Dara was a Saurian with a reputation for ruthlessness that made even hardened criminals tremble. His scales gleamed under the court lights as he rose to his impressive height of nearly 3 meh. His tail swished behind him, a habit he'd developed to distract defendants. "Honored judges," Dra began, his voice a rumbling bass that seemed to vibrate the very air. "The case before you is clear. Ambassador Bell used her diplomatic position to gain access to restricted areas on Neos Prime. There she interfered with the planetary governance system, his splurts causing widespread disruption and inciting the local population to rebel against their lawfully appointed administrators. DRA activated the evidence projector, showing surveillance footage of Bell entering a secured facility on Neos Prime. The evidence is irrefutable," he continued, gesturing to the footage with a clawed hand. "Ambassador Bell entered the Central Governance Hub on start date 4723.6. Within hours, the planet's automated systems began malfunctioning. Communications were disrupted, and most damning of all, public information terminals began broadcasting anti-Federation propaganda. The footage shifted to show crowds of the 4 armed Neosians gathering in plazas, looking at public screens displaying, well, the resolution was too poor to make out exactly what was being shown, but it certainly had the crowds agitated. And finally, Drax said with the satisfied air of someone about to deliver a killing blow, "We have testimony from Administrator Pog of Neos Prime, confirming the ambassador's actions and their disastrous consequences." The screen changed to show Administrator Pog, a particularly corpulent Neosian whose forearms were barely visible beneath the folds of his ceremonial robes. Ambassador Bell arrived on Neos Prime on the pretense of a cultural exchange. Hogs recorded. Testimony began. But from the moment she landed, she began asking suspicious questions about our governance systems, our resource allocation methods, our labor distribution networks. Then, during a tour of our central hub, she requested to use the refreshment facilities. She was gone for precisely 7 minutes and 22 seconds. When she returned, she seemed satisfied. That very same day, our systems began failing. The population became unruly. 3 centuries of perfect order. It destroyed in a single day by this human. The recording ended, and Prosecutor Dra turned to face the judges with a flourish of his tail. The Federation seeks the maximum penalty, permanent neural reconfiguration, and the charges revealed exile to the penal colony on Tartarus 4. Another murmur swept through the gallery. Neural reconfiguration. It wasn't technically execution, but many considered it worse. The process would erase everything that made Tara Bell who she was, leaving behind a compliant shell suitable only for the most basic labor. I felt my primary heart skip a beat. Even by the tribunal's harsh standards, this punishment seemed excessive for the alleged crime. Does the accused wish to respond to these allegations? Judge Pax asked, her facial ridges already flushing purple, never a good sign for the defendant. Tarabel stood, smoothing her robe with a casual gesture that seemed almost insulting in its nonchalance. I have several responses, Your Honors, she said. First, I'd like to point out that the surveillance footage shows me entering the facility, but nothing else. No evidence of tampering, sabotage, or any illegal activity. We have Administrator Pogg's testimony, Judge Krill pointed out, her head tilting, to that predatory angle. Yes, Bell nodded. The testimony of a single individual who coincidentally has the most to lose if the truth about Neo's crime were to become public knowledge. What truth? Judge Trill demanded. Bell smiled. That's exactly what I'd like to establish through proper evidence and testimony. I request the right to call witnesses. Witnesses? Prosecutor Draw scoffed. This is not an Earth courtroom, Ambassador. The tribunal does not waste time with parade of character witnesses. Not character witnesses, Bell replied calmly. Act witnesses. Specifically, I call laborer BX789 of Neo's Prime. The gallery erupted in shocked exclamations. Even I couldn't maintain my professional detachment. A laborer as a witness in the tribunal, unheard of. Silence. Grand Judge Zorix flashed a brilliant red, his translator amplifying his command. Ambassador Bell, your request is highly irregular. The tribunal does not typically hear testimony from lower castes. Bell's expression hardened. Are you saying, Grand Judge, that the tribunal of 7 worlds, the supposed pinnacle of galactic justice, refuses to hear relevant testimony based on the witness's social status? That would seem to contradict the Federation Charter Article 1, which states that all sentient beings are entitled to equal treatment under Federation law. The judges conferred among themselves, their discussion a mixture of whispers, tentacle, gestures, head tilts, and color flashes. Finally, Judge Valolo spoke. The tribunal will permit this unusual witness. Court-martial arranged for the laborer's transport from Neo's Prime. That won't be necessary, Bell said. Laborer BX789 is all ready. Here in the witness antechamber. Prosecutor Dre's tail went rigid with surprise. This is outrageous. The defense cannot bring witnesses without prior notification. Actually, Bell countered, under Emergency Provision 12 billion, a defendant facing neural reconfiguration may summon witnesses with minimal notice if their testimony might prevent an irreversible punishment from being unjustly applied. I submitted the proper documentation 6 hours ago. I had Toadmeyer her preparation. Most species confronted with the tribunal were lucky if they understood half the proceedings, let alone the procedural loopholes. Court-Martial Grun looked to the judges, who reluctantly nodded their approval. He marched to the side door and returned moments later with one of the most pitiful creatures I'd ever seen in Thetribunal. Laborer BX789 was a Neoian, but barely recognizable as such. Where Administrator Pogg had been rotunded and well-groomed, this Neoian was skeletal, his forearms so thin the bones were clearly visible. His skin, which should have been a healthy orange, was pale and covered with patches of what appeared to be chemical burns. He shuffled more than walked, his eyes downcast. State your designation for the record, Grun commanded. Laborer, BX789, Bell takes over her defense, Central Processing Facility, Neo's Prime. The Neoian responded, his voice barely audible. Laborer Bell began gently, approaching the witness stand. How long have you worked in the Central Processing Facility? 27 cycles, Ambassador. And what exactly do you process there? The laborer's eyes darted nervously toward Administrator Pogg's image, still frozen on the evidence screen. We process the planet's mineral exports. Quadrillium, or mostly quadrillium, Bell repeated, turning to address the judges. An essential component in neural interfaces used throughout the Federation. Quite valuable. I understand the Federation's economic arrangements are not on trial here, Ambassador, Judge Mox warned. No, they are not, Belg agreed. But the conditions on Neo's Prime are relevant to my defense. Laborer, could you describe your working conditions? Objection. Prosecutor Drax shouted. This line of questioning has no bearing on the charges of espionage and sabotage. I'm establishing motive, Prosecutor, Bell replied coolly. Or rather, I'm disproving the prosecution's alleged motive by revealing the true situation on Neo's Prime. Judge Lulu leaned forward. We will allow this, but it had better be relevant. Ambassador Bell nodded her thanks. Laborer, please, answer the question. BX789 swallowed hard. We work 16 hours each day in the processing chambers. The quadrillium dust, it burns the skin, damages the lungs. We are given inadequate protective gear because it's too expensive. Most laborers don't survive past 30 cycles. And who profits from your labor? Bell asked. Administrator Pog and the Governance Council. They sell the processed quadrillium to Federation merchants at prices set by the Federation Commerce Authority. And what do the laborers receive for their work? Food, rations, shelter in the dormitory compounds, medical treatment, if we can still work afterward. Bell turned to the judges. Your Honors, what I incited on Neo's Prime wasn't a rebellion. It was awareness. During my tour of the Central Hub, I noticed discrepancies between the resource allocation reports and the living conditions I'd observed. When I used the refreshment facility, I accessed a public terminal and found evidence of systematic exploitation. All I did was transfer these public records to the public information system where all Neoians could see them. You had no authorization to access those terminals. Prosecutor DRA argued, the terminals were in a public area, Bell countered, and I used my diplomatic credentials which were accepted by the system. If Administrator Pog didn't want diplomatic, visitors accessing public terminals, perhaps he shouldn't have programmed the system to accept diplomatic credentials. A few nervous laughs rippled through the gallery. Even I had to suppress a smile at the human's logic. Furthermore, Bell continued, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Federation Treaty 55529, the NEO's Prime Protectorate Agreement, specifically Section 3, which guarantees humane conditions and fair compensation for all Neoian citizens engaged in resource extraction and processing. She activated her datapad and projected the treaty text for all to see. The Federation has failed to enforce its own treaty. Administrator Pog and his council have violated it for centuries, and when these violations were exposed not by sabotage, but by simply making public information actually public, the Federation chose to prosecute me rather than address the exploitation of an entire population. The chamber fell silent. Even Prosecutor Dadra seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Finally, Judge Valolo spoke. The laborer's testimony. These allegations are serious, Ambassador, but they do not excuse unauthorized access to Neo's Prime systems. I didn't need authorization to access public information, Bell insisted. And even if I had broken some technical regulation, does that justify neural reconfiguration? Does that punishment fit the alleged crime? The punishment is severe because your actions disrupted a vital Federation resource supply. Prosecutor DRA had recovered his composure. Bad drillium production on Neo's Prime has fallen by 60% since your interference. Because the laborers are finally demanding safe conditions and fair compensation, Bell retorted, which they are entitled to under Federation law. Grand Judge Zorix flashed a contemplative blue. We will need time to consider these complex legal questions. The tribunal will recess for one standard day. The accused will remain in custody. Court-Marshal Grun struck his staff 3 times. All rise. As the judges floated away on their gravity discs, I watched Tabel consoling the trembling laborer. She whispered something to him that seemed to give him courage. His posture straightened slightly as guards led him away. When they came for Bell, she turned to look directly at me at my recording apparatus, I assumed, but then shoo-winked at me as if we shared some secret understanding. I felt a strange sensation in my secondary heart, something I hadn't experienced in centuries of court recording. It took me a moment to identify it. Hope. For the first time in my long career, I found myself hoping a defendant would win. And as they led Terabelle away, I couldn't help but wonder what the human would say tomorrow when the trial resumed. Because somehow, Against all logic and precedent, this fragile, short-lived species had managed to do something I'd thought impossible. She'd made the Tribunal of Seven Worlds question itself. And that, dear listeners, was just the beginning. I arrived at the tribunal chamber an hour early the next day. Couldn't sleep anyway. 900 years of recording rigged trials, and suddenly I cared about the outcome. Ridiculous. Yet there I was, adjusting my recording equipment with unusual thoroughness, my 6 eyes blinking in nervous anticipation. The gallery filled quickly. Word had spread about the humans' bold defense. Representatives from 37 worlds packed the observer section, their collective breathing, creating a low hum beneath the chamber's perfect acoustics. "You are fidgeting, Pibble," remarked Glix, the elderly Vixerian who maintained the Chambers' environmental systems. "Never seen you fidget before?" "I'm not fidgeting," I lied, retracting 4 of my sensory appendages that had indeed been tapping an irregular rhythm against my console. Glick's mouth parts curved into what passed for a smile among our kind. "The human's got to you, hasn't she?" Before I could deny this outrageous accusation, the chamber doors swung open and Administrator Pog waddled in, flanked by 2 private security drones. His forearms gestured animatedly as he spoke to a Federation official I recognized as Under Secretary Vane, a notorious fixer for politically sensitive cases. "That's not good," Glix whispered. No, it certainly wasn't. Vane's presence meant the Federation Council itself had taken interest in the case. The fix was in more so than usual. Court-Martial Grun appeared precisely on schedule. All rise for the honorable judges of the 7 worlds. The judges entered looking decidedly less serene than yesterday. Judge Krill's head was tilting back and forth between 30 and 60 degrees, a sign of agitation in her species. Judge Pax's facial ridges were already flushed deep purple. He and Grand Judge Zorix was cycling rapidly through colors that my translator identified as bureaucratic concern, political pressure, and oddly gastric distress. "Bring in the accused," Grun commanded, striking his staff. Ambassador Tara Bell entered, still radiating that inexplicable confidence. If she noticed Administrator Pog or the first day concludes under Secretary Vane, she gave no indication. Her focus remained entirely on the judges. The Tribunal of 7 Worlds reconvenes in the matter of the Galactic Federation versus Ambassador Tabel of Earth. Run announced, all prior testimony and evidence remain part of the